Let me start again. First, could I thank BYU Law and the International Centre for Law and Religion Studies for putting on this wonderful conference on the critical topic of religion, law and social stability. As a practicing Catholic and as the Dean of the Law School in Sydney, of the oldest Catholic and the oldest private university in Australia, this topic is a critical one for me and for my institution. I want to start this discussion with a quote from St. Paul's first letter to Timothy, which really frames what I'm going to say. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercessions and thanksgiving should be offered for everyone, for kings and others in authority, so that we may be able to live peaceful and quiet lives with all devotion and propriety. That's 1 Timothy 2, 1-2 from the New Jerusalem Bible. This afternoon I'll consider religion, religious tolerance and the law and their importance in maintaining social stability in Australia. In order to address this question, I will very briefly consider the influence of religion in the foundation and development of Australia before considering the place of religion in contemporary Australian society. With this background, I will then consider some examples of where religion and law find themselves in conflict in Australia at the moment, before expressing some views on the implications of those conflicts for Australia's social stability. Hopefully some of these thoughts will also resonate with many of you from other jurisdictions. In many ways, contemporary Australia appears to me to be a model of religious tolerance. The European colonisation of Australia began in 1788 as a result of a decision by the English Parliament to institute a new penal colony. When New South Wales was first colonised, Governor Phillip took a particularly sectarian oath of office as governor by swearing allegiance to the King and to the Protestant succession, whilst expressly repudiating Romish beliefs in the transubstantiation of the Eucharist. Subsequent early governors of New South Wales took an oath of office which also included these words. Although a significant number of the convicts transported to the new colony were both Irish and Catholic, despite very many polite requests, it was 28 years before the Colonial Office in Britain allowed official Catholic chaplains into the colony, and it was only after 1820 that Catholic convicts were no longer often forced to attend Anglican services. Given that background, it's remarkable in many respects that when the colonies federated only 80 years later, the new Australian Commonwealth's constitution specifically eschewed an establishment religion. The overt sectarianism which was prevalent most obviously in employment practices up until the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s in Australia has really disappeared, and it's difficult to imagine that that very basic religious freedom to worship within one's personal faith tradition would be impinged in Australia. Whilst the religious landscape of Australia is a constantly evolving one, Australia certainly has deep historical Christian roots, and a very substantial majority of Australians have always and continue to identify themselves with religious traditions when asked. From the first census in 1911, the majority of Australians have identified as Christians. Whilst this affiliation has been declining from 96% in 1911 to 61% in 2011, the Christian faith traditions continue to be dominant in Australia, although the numbers of adherents of other faiths and of no religion has been increasing. Between 2001 and 2011, the number of people reporting a faith tradition other than Christianity increased markedly from about 0.9 million to 1.5 million. The numbers of no religion respondents also increased substantially from 15% of the population in 2001 to 22% in 2011. The fact that Australia continues to welcome about 190,000 migrants each year under the official migration program, that immigration levels can change, and that there are, of course, no religious tests for immigrants to Australia, means that the attitudes of a not insubstantial proportion of the population cannot be predicted and change each year. Whilst Australia is often described as a post-Christian nation, it's quite clear that a very substantial proportion of the Australian population continue to consider themselves to be Christians, and that Australia continues to grow in religious diversity. To a visitor to Australia in 2015, many outward signs would suggest a strong respect for religious freedom. There is federal and state government funding for religious schools. There are 2 national religiously affiliated universities, my university, the University of Notre, Australia, and the Australian Catholic University. Churches and other places of worship are prominent in cities, suburbs and towns and are generally well maintained, and there are many hospitals, charities, retirement homes, clubs and other institutions, and I'll come back to this, operated by religious organisations which are a feature of everyday life in Australia. In Australia, religious people do not face threats to their life and property as they do in Iraq or Syria and many other parts of the world. But outward appearances can prove quite deceptive, and the views of those of religious faith, and particularly those of my faith tradition, Catholicism, are subject to regular attack, often because of their faith. The former High Court judge and leading Australian intellectual, the Honourable Dyson Heydon, who is not from the Catholic faith tradition, a couple of years ago made the following observation. Until about the 1960s, Australian society was marked by sectarianism. It took several forms. In due course, all of that changed. But now there may be a new anti-Catholic movement, particularly among the intellectuals, if that is the correct word for journalists. Anti-Catholicism in Australia now might be called the racism of the intellectuals. End quote. And nothing's improved since then. Whilst in Australia, as I said, Christians are certainly free to worship at home and in their churches without fear of attack or fear for their physical safety, there is a misconception by many in the media and in education and in government that this is all that religious freedom entails. This approach disregards entirely the moral duty of Christians, not only to live morally, but to evangelise and to act. And this action can be seen in the huge contribution that Christians have made to Australia. Christians also have a moral duty not to allow God to disappear from the marketplace of ideas. Many in Australian society, particularly in the media, express concern whenever Christians speak on moral matters. This is because Australian society, like most of the modern West, approaches morality largely by reference to individual freedom, rights, scientism, subjectivism, pragmatism and relativism. References to absolute moral truths are an anathema to a subjectivist approach to morality. But for many Australians, and I'm sure this is true of much of the Western world, state laws have become a de facto morality. And this is a profoundly important fact that lawmakers need to recognise if they consider that law is or should be morally neutral, assuming that was a possibility. Whilst at law, at least where laws do not require active participation in moral acts, it might be said that laws leave citizens free to act morally and to act in accordance with their consciences, even if they allow acts which are immoral to occur. As I've noted, a feature of modern Australian society is the fact that the law by default is considered by many as the source of morality. Changes in legislation, judicial or prosecutorial practice can present strong temptations for people to engage even in acts that were considered generally immoral by previous generations. It's only necessary to mention divorce, contraception, drug use, abortion and in vitro fertilisation to recognise this trend. Some of these involve general acceptance of conduct, not only that was generally recognised as immoral by previous generations, but is recognised as immoral under the natural law. The willingness to speak up when something is wrong and to tell it like it is have long been referred to as traditional Australian values. It's difficult to argue that those values remain prevalent in Australian society. Any fair observer of Australian society would recognise that there's a form of creeping conformity, whether it is in business, the media or in a social setting, in which it is really considered quite unacceptable to promote or justify a position on any issue by reference to religious values. At the same time, there are well-organised and focused special interest groups who are very skilled in their use of the media and in lobbying politicians to promote the recognition of new rights and the restriction of the free exercise of existing rights through legislation and developments in the common law. With that background, I'll just consider a couple of examples of how religious freedom is being impacted in Australia. And those relate to the laws in relation to abortion, the decision of the Victorian Court of Appeal in Christian youth camps, and the recent referral of the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commission, which Father Lucas mentioned yesterday. Since 2008 in Victoria, medical practitioners with a conscientious objection to abortion have been obliged to refer patients seeking that procedure to another medical practitioner who they know does not share that objection. In this way, the law seeks to compel doctors with a conscientious objection to abortion to be complicit in that procedure, although information about abortion providers is readily available on the internet and in the phone book. Some years ago, disciplinary proceedings were brought against Dr. Mark Hobart, a well-known pro-life doctor in Victoria, for refusing to refer a couple seeking to terminate their pregnancy on sex selection grounds to a doctor who he knew did not share his objection. The state I live, New South Wales, has enacted similar requirements through a policy directive rather than through legislation, although legislation is also proposed. In the state of Tasmania, exclusion zones make it a criminal offence to protest or engage in a range of other prescribed activities within a 150-metre radius of an abortion clinic. Victoria, New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory are considering similar legislation. During the Tasmanian elections last year, a lone protester, Graham Preston, was arrested for peacefully protesting outside an abortion clinic in Hobart. He held up a sign which had an extract from one of the United Nations declarations. Whilst those charges were subsequently dropped, Mr. Preston and a number of other people are currently awaiting trial in Tasmania for other alleged breaches of the exclusion zone. In 2014, the Victorian Supreme Court of Appeal decision involving Christian youth camps found that a company owned and operated by the Christian Brethren had engaged in unlawful discrimination by very politely declining a booking by a group promoting views on sexual morality to young people, which were contrary to those of that faith tradition. As Father Lucas said yesterday, in Tasmania on the 29th of September this year, the Archbishop of Hobart, Archbishop Julian Porteous, was reported to Tasmania's Anti-Discrimination Commission for circulating a booklet called Don't Mess with Marriage to the parents of students at Catholic schools in Tasmania. The Commission has 6 weeks to consider whether or not that complaint identifies a potential breach of the very broadly worded Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. So what are the implications of this approach to religious tolerance? An unexpressed assumption favouring this approach may be an assumption that religious belief is simply a matter of upbringing or choice. The assumption that religious belief is somehow of lesser value and more easily altered than some other characteristics ought to be subjected to more critical review. In her 1917 work, Spontaneous Activity in Education, Maria Montessori relays a number of accounts of children brought up with no exposure at all to any form of religion, experiencing God and identifying God as the creator of all. For many Christians, baptism is a sacrament. In the Catholic faith tradition, baptism most commonly occurs in early infancy. It certainly did for me. And the theology of the Catholic Church tells us that not only does baptism cleanse the person of original sin, but it makes that person a new creature, an adopted son of God, a partaker of the divine nature, a member of Christ and co-heir with him and a temple of the Holy Spirit, a member of the body of Christ and a member of the Church. As the Catholic Catechism explains, for adherents of that faith tradition, the person baptised is configured to Christ. Baptism seals the Christian with the indelible spiritual mark of his belonging to Christ. No sin erases this mark, even if sin prevents baptism from bearing the fruits of salvation. The consequence for the baptised person are permanent. The person is changed forever by baptism, and for a baptised Catholic, these characteristics are not flexible, optimal extras that can be, or which society should seek to force a believer to compromise. Since religious belief is such an integral part of a religious person can only flourish when they are freely able to worship and to actually live their faith. As Laycock and Berg argue, committed religious believers argue that some aspects of human identity are so fundamental that they should be left to each individual, free of all non-essential regulation, even when manifested in conduct. For religious believers, the conduct at issue is to live and act consistently with the demands of the being that they believe made us and holds the whole world together. No religious believer can change his understanding of divine command by any act of will. Religious beliefs can change over time, but these things do not change because governments say they must, or because the individual decides they should. The religious believer cannot change God's mind." End quote. Finally, it is important to recognise that religion is not simply a personal characteristic, but it has been a foundational element to Australia. It's obvious that nations like the United States, Canada and Australia have benefited greatly from the failure of other nations to afford the same type of religious freedom to their citizens in the past, such that to their great loss, religious minorities have emigrated to those nations of the New World to their great benefit. Micklethwaite and Wooldridge have analysed the reasons for the persistence of religious belief in the United States, and in this context they particularly emphasise the basic works of everyday charity that churches and believers carry out throughout the United States as a standard part of life. In an Australian context, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, Archbishop Anthony Fisher, has observed that the Catholic Church in Australia now has over 10,000 hospital beds, 20,000 aged care places, 700,000 school desks, and assists countless people through parishes, Catholic Care and St Vincent de Paul. 5.5 million Catholics in 1,300 parishes in every walk of life contribute in myriad ways to our nation. Democracies, economies and societies don't just happen. They depend upon a complex of ideals, priorities and institutions. And in this country, these are largely a Judeo-Christian inheritance, however underappreciated that often is." End quote. Whilst Archbishop Fisher there singled out some particular contributions of the Catholic Church, followers of many other faith traditions have made and continue to make their own many and unique contributions to the well-being of the nation and its people. The Salvation Army and the Seventh-day Adventists warrant particular attention as small denominations which have made and continue to make an extraordinary contribution. Calls for religious freedom are not on the evidence special pleading. The state cannot, on the one hand, enjoy all of the benefits religion provides to the infrastructure and everyday life of the country, and on the other hand, seek to prevent the expression of religious belief.